Well, welcome back, Michael Aquino. We're in part two of Basis 70. And we want to talk about manufactured realities. You've got three good books about this kind of thing. And we've just been talking there, just off mic, about Colonel Tom, retired Colonel Tom Bearden, and in the 1930s how the physics had material removed from it because of the gerrymandering of the physics which happened at the end of the 1800s, or possibly a lot earlier than that. Some argue that a lot of the technology today has been available for about 100 years, if not more, but the ability to actually engineer space-time. And there's this thing that's going around called the Mandela effect, where there seems to be indications of false realities. And I mean, we're here in Wiltshire, the home of the wonderful crop circles, and a lot of these are made. I know the guys who make them, but they actually have temporal anomaly issues, and there are some issues nowadays. I might be able to say this, but you certainly probably couldn't, where you don't need to put a barbed wire fence around a military installation. You just project a fake reality around it, and all they see is sunshine, or trees, or a blank mountain. Well, let's get down to the work you were doing on that in those three books. This idea of the different reality, the manufacturing of it.
Okay, I'll just mention those titles very briefly. That's essentially a trilogy of books among the 13 or 14 that I've got published at the moment. And these are Mind War, Mind Star, and Find Far. And these are all one-word titles. And the easiest way to find them is to go on to Amazon, either UK or in the USA, and type in my name, Michael Aquino, as an author, and you'll find a whole list of my books, and you'll find these in there with links to the published editions in both paperback and Kindle ebook form. So I'll mention that again as we get towards the end here, and we're telling people where they can go if they want to get into this stuff in detail, because what we're obviously talking about right now is fairly rapid fire during our conversation here, and people's eyes can glaze over very quickly listening to this stuff.
Well, I want you to go into the detail, but some reviews of those books are just have been saying, perhaps slightly unkindly, that it's a sugar coating on a pretty damn serious thing. Different worlds, different dimensions. Can I mention? Well, I
don't intend anything to be sugar coated. Actually, I try to be very straight talk about things. But again, we're dealing with a sort of a subculture in which there are people with vested interests and who either don't want this information to get out, or if they want it to get out, they want it to get out in certain controlled ways that they can profit from or control other people by. I'm a very disinterested person about the books that I write in this area. I'm not trying to make $1 million or get a screen contract or get promoted. I'm retired at this point. I'm interested in the truth. I've always been a truth freak, you might say. And I also am very much interested in plain talk. In other words, I hate jargon. I hate obscure words that mean nothing, that people sometimes hide behind when we've already discussed how people will take a word like dimension and they'll use it in a very fuzzy way because they know that the audience doesn't know what the hell a dimension is. Whereas during our last hour, I said, okay, here's dimension 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and bang, they're not that hard. They're right in front of our nose, and here's what they are. So I'm a simple, straightforward talker and a truth freak. And
well, I concur with that, sir. This is exactly what I want you to do right now, and let's go for it. Okay.
Okay. So you were asking, I believe, when we took a break about extraterrestrial phenomena, things like UFOs and visitors from outer space.
Well, exactly, but I mean, the whole point is that the term extraterrestrial is, in my opinion, a distraction. It's interdimensional. The ancients knew about this. A good old soldier, John Irwin, British secret missions, 1950s, discovered. They got data banks. The British military got data banks in Jarraba 1959 of ancient, extremely high technology data banks, information from that Atlantean era of interdimensional technologies, the kind of stuff that gets you Star Wars, gets you into the other universes. They got that.
Well, here's my answer to that. Again, I can tell you, I can sort of give you a go no go approach to some things that are in the highly classified libraries, you might say, of places like U.S. Space Command and CIA. So I can say, here there lies bullshit, and here there doesn't. Okay, so without actually violating any classified information. So now I'm going to tell you how this whole situation actually works. And this is where, again, we bring Fort Bragg into it, which is our nerve center for dealing with the psychology and the operational features of what you call thought architecture of the human consciousness. And again, this is all discussed in sort of mind-glazing detail in Mind War for anybody who wants to go into it and see, okay, this guy Aquino is saying this stuff, let's have him put up or shut up. Well, the put up is in these books, and they're not that expensive, so have at it, And again, some of the reviewers have said, well, he's making actually a pretty good case for having at it. So anyway, here's the quick and dirty. First of all, let's take a look at that objective universe again. Let's throw out Mr. Einstein right at the start, because he said that nothing can travel faster than the speed of light, or 186,000 miles per second. He doesn't explain what happens if somebody is traveling at 186,000 miles per second and then puts their foot on the gas in their spaceship. He just sort of blanks out there. And if you're an academic mathematician or astrophysicist, then you're not supposed to ask questions like that any more than you're supposed to ask questions about, well, who created the Big Bang before it went bang, and so on. You're just not supposed to ask those kinds of questions. So I asked them, and I want to know. And here's the answer. The ability of a physical object to travel in the objective universe faster than the speed of light is not a problem at all. It's you just put your foot on the accelerator and it goes faster. But what happens? What happens, and this is where Einstein kind of missed the boat, and a lot of other people miss the boat even today, but which we know about very well in U.S. Space Command and so on. You outstrip your means of reference and communication with the other points in the objective universe. You're outstripping the speed of radio waves and vibratory systems in the electromagnetic spectrum that you use to communicate. You're basically traveling with your physical object faster than any of those things can catch you. So, as far as you're concerned, the rest of the universe, the objective universe around you, blanks out because there's no way that you have of communicating with it anymore through the electromagnetic spectrum, because you're outdistancing that spectrum. And the reverse also happens, that people who are trying to track you and communicate with you will see you blank out and go to zero, because their radar waves or radio waves can't reach you anymore. They can't catch you. You're outstripping them. So what we're looking at here is not that anything physically disappears with relation to anything else. It outstrips the means of communication. This whole business of the electromagnetic spectrum is of vital importance here, because that's the thing that ties reality together.
Well, Tom Bearden would use the term scalar or longitudinal waves. Shall I introduce those terms?
Well, that's a part of the electromagnetic spectrum, and he can use those terms. I like to keep things simple. The electromagnetic spectrum is something you can Google anytime you want, and you'll see that it reaches basically the entire range of waves, from the very long to the very short, and also of, in addition to electric polarities, it embraces magnetism. And magnetism is sort of the side flip, when you turn something 90 degrees, you turn an electrical impulse 90 degrees, you get a magnetic counterbalance to it, and so on. So you've got this system of electromagnetism, or the electromagnetic spectrum. And this is the mechanism of the objective universe, and everything that you and I do when we interact with it is essentially screwing with a part of that. We have our vision, we have our hearing. All of these occupy points on the electromagnetic spectrum. So, and they actually occupy very small points on it. So if you begin to look at this, you find that there's an enormous amount of stuff that's going on around us that we're simply not aware of. That the only way we can detect it is with instruments, and a lot of times those instruments are very crude and are not able to make sense of it in the way that we make sense of things that come in through our eyes and ears, which our brains have patterns that they change into reality perceptions for us, or what we call in the business pattern thinking. Now, to understand the importance of this, you have to understand that in terms of brain architecture and the functioning of your physical brain, 95% of your thinking takes place subconsciously at this level of pattern thinking. And this is essentially your concept and your standard of reality with a capital R. 5% is what we call algorithmic thinking, and that is what you would normally think of as your conscious thinking, which is your active processing of information, such as we're doing during this telephone call right now. That algorithmic 5% is very transitory, very unreliable, and very unstable, so that unless you make a record of it, or unless you concentrate on it, you forget it very soon and very quickly and very easily. The stuff that sticks with you and that determines your perception of reality all takes place at that subconscious 95%, and that's what Mind War as a concept and as a book addresses and drags everybody kicking and screaming into, and says, this is where your perception of reality takes place. This is where reality is actually occurring, as we are able to perceive it from that outside vantage point, that that fifth dimension we're talking about. So, who controls that 95%, you might say, or who administers it, or who adjusts it, controls reality. Now we're getting into areas like George Orwell's 1984, where O'Brien is talking to Winston Smith and saying the party controls reality, and if the party says that I float off this floor like a soap bubble, and the party has convinced you to agree, then it happens, and that's reality and that's truth, and anything else is not. Now, people interpret that as a sort of science fiction fluff on Orwell, but actually it's quite real and quite serious, and it's a good thing that most people interpret it as fluff. There are some people who have come very close in history to understanding that this isn't fluff at all, that this business of reality creation is quite real, and if you can take your subjective universe and you understand the mechanisms by which you can project it on other people, then you are creating a reality for them that is their reality. Probably the most famous and somewhat notorious example of this in the 20th century was Adolf Hitler, who said, this is the reality of Germany, this is the reality of concepts like race, and this is the future of the human race, and all you have to do is share my vision of it, and that's reality, and that's the future. And that's the explanation for how an entire nation of people sort of what external people would say went along with him on 12 years of madness. But as far as they were concerned, it wasn't madness at all. It was reality. And the rest of the world just didn't perceive it yet.
Well, the modern world of computers is bringing us to a very, very stark reality of the machine.
Oh, sure. You bet. And one of the problems that I get into in FindFar in identifying our modern issues is that we sort of deal from an algorithmic history of human discretionary thinking in that 5%, but more and more people are becoming conditioned and accustomed to things like iPhones and computers, where there is a digital reality that is pre-programmed out there, and humans are expected to adapt to it rather than using it as a tool.
But it's been
and
argued.
That is dangerous.
It's very dangerous because, I mentioned Paget again, but I mean I've been observing this for some time. It's a Trojan horse. The concepts of reality management of human consciousness, we're handing it all over to the computer technology. The NSA is monitoring everything, and the point is the humans think they're in charge. They aren't. We have lost control.
Yes, and it's actually moving very fast, faster than most people would appreciate in that direction, in the areas of artificial intelligence, because the sort of the dividing line between what's a conscious being and what isn't is being rapidly eroded in terms of AI computer systems.
Well, I say again in part two, in the Times newspaper in London seems to be following this transhumanization story. Elon Musk mentioned that the only way that human beings are going to survive is to become computer, is to have these things in them. And I've been following individuals with implants, things that seem to have been grown inside their brains to take control, to enhance their senses when we had 18 or 15 senses originally. But this, in other words, the machine technology, the biology machine barrier has been successfully broken. The biology will assimilate with the machine technology. It will not reject. It works together. And that is now in progress in rapid effect. And that is, as Elon Musk said, humanity is facing existential extinction, and that is about deleted.
I will hold out some hope here, because we're now getting into the area of my second book in that trilogy, called Mind Star, which very much addresses the concept of the human soul, or Mind Star as I use it, since I don't find the term soul covers it, because, for example, back in ancient Egypt, the Egyptians were sufficiently advanced in this so that they came up with an eightfold division of consciousness, which I go into in considerable detail in there. And of course, Plato and other classicists, Pythagoras, used techniques such as anamnesis, to go in and explore and break down these various components of the soul. But here's what I want to kind of respond to you with along that line. What we're looking at when we look at computers is an externally and artificially limited definition of reality that they operate within. And what human consciousness has is an unlimited ability to create spontaneously. This is a discretionary or conceptual thought, as I use the term in the book Mind War when I'm talking about that. Because remember, we have pattern thinking, we have algorithmic thinking, and there's also conceptual thinking, this is Plato's noesis, this is Kant's pure reason, this is the ability as Nietzsche referred to it, of the human intelligence to create new horizons beyond existing realities. So it is the raw creation force, and this is the interesting thing that so far computers have not bridged. They can assemble things from a pre-existing menu of stuff. What they can't do is to create spontaneously. They cannot enter Nietzsche's realm and build new horizons beyond the known.
But
they can just simply rearrange that.
But that is why they need the human. They need that aspect of humanity, so it will essentially parasite on us.
What humanity is doing right now, which is a sort of a bad, a bad way of looking at this, is humanity, in an attempt to cooperate with the machinery that we've created around us, we're artificially rejecting our creative ability and our creative powers so that we stay within the machine world, we stay within the world of the computers.
Well,
and
exactly.
This is the big danger. When you read these alarmist stories, this is what they're getting at, is the fact that when you look at kids today, they don't think like we used to. They think within the limitations of the iPhone that they're holding.
Yes, well, they won't be holding it anymore. It'll be inside their heads. The point is that
Yes.
we have the physics of the mass media, which is basically pushing the Einstein fraud, the
I know.
3D,
Not
the
not my
3D
fault.
world. No, no, no. We've got the 3D world. We've got the fake alien invasion stuff from an external alien threat using,
Hmm.
and then of course the astronomers go through this rubbish of communicating with radio waves, which is ridiculous. It's not going to communicate anywhere. It
Yeah.
can't go faster than light because it is light. So we have the farce of
Right.
modern science, which is essentially a dogma. It's not science. It's worse than religion.
Okay, now I'm going to take you. Now I'm going to take you again. Through the looking glass here a little bit again, and explain things like the UFOs and so on. And that is very close and very much in line with what we've kind of been going over, so far. There's the objective universe, which is dimensions 1 through 4 of physical phenomena, which is matter, antimatter, and energy. Then there is an individual subjective universe, which is an external interpretation and projection of personal creativity upon that perception of the objective universe. And then there is this thing called a CSU, or a collective subjective universe, that is one or a number of individual subjective universes that are combined and asserted to be reality. But this is a composite reality it represents itself as being here. This is the objective universe, kids, and understand it and believe it. My name is Albert Einstein, and this is the objective universe, and you just simply have to buy this and regurgitate it. Well, no, you're not seeing the objective universe. You're seeing a CSU. You're seeing a collective, and in many cases an endorsed, whether it's by academia or by science, you're seeing an endorsed subjective universe projection. And this is reality, in quotes, that most people think is reality, but is actually a combination of subjective creation and mixed in with a certain amount of detection of the objective universe. So, you're quite right when you said a few minutes ago that when you talk about attempted communications with other beings through radio waves and so on, that isn't going to get us anywhere. And of course, you're quite right. Those things are limited to the speed of the electromagnetic spectrum, and it would take X numbers of hundreds of thousands of years to travel between there and there. However, the human creative consciousness is not limited to the objective universe. It travels as fast as it needs to and as far as it wishes to, because it's generating its reality, including these external realities. But that doesn't mean that these things are fantasies necessarily, although fantasies can be part of it. Because what we're also doing is pulling up on our own innate, what you might call racial memory, that goes back almost infinitely. And this is what Plato is getting into for people who care to study it in the Meno, when he's talking about anamnesis, which is this notion of recovered memories from your own consciousness that have to do with the sort of racial memory principles of the universe. This is apprehending the forms, the principles. This is that noesis ability by which people recognize a certain standard of existence or perfection when they see it. All of the Platonic dialogues are exercises in what's called the dialectic, which is a sort of reductionist argument through logic, but ultimately they all wind up at a point of apprehension of the metaphysical underlying principle, and that is the mental force of noesis, which involves enlightened intuition, which is not guesswork. It means you're putting your finger on something that is sort of at the nerve center of this entire force area of the universe. So when we're looking at, first let's get rid of one minor side detail here. Is there UFO stuff out there? Sure, lots of it. When I was assigned to Cheyenne Mountain and
Now,
so on.
before you go there, what do
Yeah.
you call UFO stuff?
I'm going right into that. When we looked with the big eye, at what's going on up above the planet, the arrays and detection systems of NORAD and U.S. Spacecom see everything that's going on above the planetary atmosphere. I'm talking about anything bigger than a rock, shows up. So it's that detailed and that precise. The problem is not that the stuff is there. The problem is that there's so damn much of it, and most of it is junk. We're talking about, space is cluttered up with a whole lot of trash, both pieces of planetary stuff, and meteorites and meteors, and not to mention tons and tons of wreckage from all the stuff that's been launched from Earth in terms of space satellites and platforms.
Are you talking close orbit or Planet X and its debris field and all that stuff?
Well, I'm talking close orbit and what you might call, slightly beyond close orbit, where you have things that approach Earth from outside. And we picked up this stuff all the time, and the problem is not that it was there. In other words, there's lots of UFO. The problem is, so what? How much of this stuff do we have to pay attention to? And the dividing line is not whether or not the stuff is there and whether or not you can identify it as something previous or not. And some of this stuff would be very brief and very fast, and kind of come in and out of the detection systems. The question became one of, is this something that we need to worry about as dangerous or not? And that's that became the point of measurement, and basically still is, because you can't really pay attention to all the stuff, nor is there really any need to. The question is there anything up there that looks like it might be a Russian missile coming in, or is there something that is big enough and dangerous enough, like like the meteor that hit Siberia or whatever, that we all need to run to the hills or something? And if it's not dangerous,
I'd like to talk about that.
We don't worry about it.
I'd like to talk about that. Sorry to interrupt you on that. The Russians are talking about an Earth defense system which goes back to the ancient times, that it shot the Tunguska thing down. It happened again relatively recently, and then more recently, in literally the last a couple of years, that there is this technology which is here to defend ourselves against these objects coming in, which are dangerous. The problem is, according to the Russians, it's running out of ammo, and we need to do something about it.
Well, we have. I don't know that I would go along with that. There's a bit of a tall story, I think, there, but. Yes, you could, if you had, and there have been movies, that have sort of played around with this idea that if you have a
Forbidden
big meteor,
Planet,
for example, that's headed to the planet,
yeah,
then you could shoot a nuclear weapon at it and knock it off into a different course,
or just create a whole lot more garbage to hit more cities.
Yeah, well, or you just break it up, into a bunch of little stuff that by the time it went through the atmosphere would be pretty much harmless. But so I'm just saying that this was not what you're talking about here was not a particular concern of Space Command. We were more interested in is something coming in that is something that we need to worry about as dangerous or not. And if it isn't, then to hell with it. And if it is, okay, then let's pay attention to it. And during the time I was there, we really didn't have anything coming in that was that met the danger threshold. There was just a lot of space junk, up there. So I'm just telling you that that's kind of how these detection systems work, from our angle on it. Now, that being said, so a lot of the phenomena that people may look up and see or track with their amateur detection systems is, in fact, quite real and quite fast and moving around up there. And people can figure out what they want to about it.
Well, type 3 night vision goggles for a start seems to be pretty good.
Sure, but unless it lands in your backyard and you can go look at it, then it's sort of irrelevant as far as the National Reconnaissance Office, that I was working with is concerned. Let us know, if something lands in your backyard, and we'll come take a look. Until then, don't worry about it, and that's sort of the official attitude, because anything beyond that would just simply tax abilities. You've got a an enormous amount, and John Alexander touches on this in his book. You got an enormous amount of people seeing this and that and the other thing, and all wanting the government to explain it, interpret it, and the rest of it. And usually the government, as I said, just isn't bothering because there's too much of this stuff.
Well, since you've mentioned John's name again, okay, the too hot to handle cases, can you give us some examples of too hot to handle actuals in that?
Well, this is going to stretch people's heads a little bit, and this is the point where some people may say Aquino's nuts or he's out of it. Okay, I'm not going to worry about that. I'm just going to just tell you the situation as I've experienced it and I've seen it. And that is this. Let's go back to that CSU business, that collective subjective reality business. And that is that when you're talking about these intelligences that people like to think of as external intelligences from outer space or other dimensions, quote unquote, again, using that sloppy way that people have of talking about dimensions, whether you're Steven Spielberg in the fourth Indiana Jones movie or whatever. This is not stuff that exists in the objective universe out there. This is stuff that exists within ourselves in this deep memory that we have that is accessible through anamnesis and that can be used to create composite or collective subjective universes that can then be shared with other people. And because it stems from a collective racial memory, you might say, is credible with them. So if, for example, a British airman sees a UFO sitting in a field by his base, that's not necessarily objective universal phenomena. That could very well be his triggering of a subjective universe memory within his own subconscious, and we're talking about that 95% again. And that is also built up from a number of patterns that have very much to do with all of the different psychological control systems that I discuss in Mind War.
Are you talking? Sorry, are you basically talking about some people talk to a different set of 100 monkeys than other people talking to their 100 monkey effect?
Well, not necessarily. I don't know that I'd use that analogy, but what I'm saying
is a very distorted version of it.
There is a very complex memory and knowledge base within everybody's brain, and much of it is common knowledge. In other words, this is a sort of what you might call racial memory, but it is very much there, and it is very traceable. It is very identifiable, and when you invoke a piece of it and you communicate it to somebody else, such as a second airman, that you say, "Come and look at this and see," then you can awaken that very same thing in that person, and then you have an eyewitness to a phenomenon that may not exist in the objective universe per se, but is very real in terms of your collective subjective universes. And that's what John Alexander has examples of in his book, where he's saying that he has this colonel and that colonel who swear, that they saw this or that thing in their backyards.
But it's a bit like people who say, who take orbs with these entities or beings. They take orbs, or their camera takes a picture of that particular thing, and they get somebody else's camera, and somebody else's camera will take a picture of that thing, but the person holding the other camera doesn't. Well, I'd have to see some examples of that aren't very transparently just atmospheric anomalies,
or that aren't outright fraud, because there's an enormous amount of that going around.
I know about but it's a bit like 100 people in an audience, but only 2 of them see the UFO.
Mm-hmm. Well, when you're talking about visual, when you're talking about personal testimony of reality, that's one thing. When you're talking about objective scientific recording of stuff, then that's where you get into the argumentative stuff. And I frankly have yet to see anything that's a photograph or a piece of sort of what you might call hard evidence of something extraterrestrial that isn't easily doctorable or couldn't be easily interpreted in any number of other ways.
There's an awful lot of people talking about a lot of nuclear weapon silos being shut down by these things, whatever they are. I mean, that's a lot of very senior military people talking about this sort of stuff in large numbers.
I don't buy that would be necessarily proof of something extraterrestrial. There's a lot of ways that you can tinker with the grid, with the electromagnetic spectrum here on Earth, and I go into a lot of that adjustment in Mind War. And I would, when people are trying to understand this whole business of collective subjective universes, and they're simply saying, well, Michael Aquino sounds like he's saying that people build up these things as collective imagination. Okay? It's not quite that simple, because a lot of this is very, very dependent upon the manipulation of physical forces and energies, which is what I go into in Mind War. This stuff is there like a toolbox. Okay? It's not esoteric. It's not imaginative. These are things you can mess with. They have to do with brain waves. They have to do with magnetic fields. They have to do with color perceptions, with the reactions to certain levels of audio frequencies and so on that are at the subconscious level. All this stuff is going on, and you're not aware of it because you're not attuned to it, and you're not paying attention to it.
What
I tell people to do is, if I'm among all my other pursuits, I'm also a stage magician. Here in the United States, we have the Magic Castle in Hollywood. It's a little bit like your Magic Circle over there in the UK, of professional magicians. And professional stage magicians know about this stuff because they're in the business of creating collective subjective interpretations of reality. That's what stage magic is. It's showing you something that is impossible or that doesn't exist and saying, here it is, it exists, and it's real, and it's believable, because that's how I'm formulating and fashioning it for you. So when I hold this hat up and pull a rabbit out of it that wasn't there, you'll believe it, because the way I introduced you to this whole thing, puts your mind in that kind of an attitude whereby it accepts what I'm conditioning you to as reality.
But this is more than just little subtle triggers and subliminals. It's
you'll be surprised. It's the same principle. What we're doing at a very small level with stage magic is what is being done at a very large level with your brain in this 95% of stuff that right now is mostly randomized, but that can be controlled, which is what the Mind War book gets into. So what I'm saying is that we live in a manageable perception of reality. And sometimes that is managed deliberately. Sometimes it's just simply managed accidentally. But it is a soup that we swim in that most people simply aren't aware of. And that's what I wrote the book about, to say, because here's why I wrote the book. I hate the idea that humanity is busy shooting itself and blowing itself up all the time. We're in a constant state of what I call physical war, that is getting worse and worse and more dangerous and more permanent. As we look around us right now, everybody's shooting everybody else, blowing themselves up, and destroying stuff. And I have always had a loathing of that. That's why I got into the whole area of psychological operations in the first place, way back in the 60s, as a second lieutenant, because I said, gee, I'd much rather argue people into a solution than I would shooting them into a solution. And all of the research that I've done since then to this really deep stuff that I've gone into in these books here has to do with that basic principle of stopping the bloodshed, So Mind War can be dangerous to the standpoint that it messes with people's ideas of reality, because if you get that in the hands of the wrong people, again, you wind up with an Orwellian 1984 or an Adolf Hitler. So we're taking a chance here, but the alternative is not a zero-sum game. the alternative is that the planet sooner or later blows itself up and kills lots and lots of other people, and is very dangerously close to doing it, as previously mentioned, in the area of nuclear weaponry, on which we are on a closer and closer hair trigger all the time.
And
So,
very advanced energy weapons, or
yes.
energetic weapons. Now we're coming.
Sure.
We've got about 20 minutes left. If I'm one of the things which you're known for is being in what's called the astral. What exactly is that? What does that mean? Or do you want to talk about that?
Well, again, that's a term that's been used kind of very loosely, including by a lot of what I'd call fluffy bunny occultists. So, you have an astral glow around you, or this or that. Well, behind some of these vague fluffy bunny terms, there is a very hard reality, and in this case, it has to do with electromagnetic fields that surround your body, or what has been in science, where it was specifically examined, sometimes known as life fields or L fields. Now, we're talking about the universe, again, as an electrical phenomenon. And again, I would suggest to your listeners that they go on the computer and Google electrical universe, and they'll find all kinds of interesting discussions of this whole concept, which looks at the objective universe as a big mess of electromagnetic spectrum activity, electromagnetic forces that are swirling around. And this also has to do with the sun's control of the Earth and other planetary and stellar systems' control of the Earth through electromagnetic influences. And also, within the Earth, it has to do with you. It has to do with you as a person. Sure, in the area of astrology, it's not so much that you're looking up and you're seeing this or that constellation moving around. It has to do with the balancing effects of different external electromagnetic fields and forces, and gravitational fields and forces. Gravity is another one of those things that's messing with us all the time. And it has nothing to do with this or that constellation, because of course the constellations have been changing around all the time. You've got the precision of the equinoxes and the rest of it. So they are a form of measurement, but they're not the actual function. The actual function is all this electromagnetic soup, that's been swirling around. I go into that again in Mind War, to a great detail. And there was a book by Guy Playfair, Playfair, and Scott Hill, that came out in the 60s or 70s, called The Cycles of Heaven, and which is basically has to do with, again, all these astrophysical forces and what they're really doing to you. So if you have a person who's a confirmed astrologer, I would say, go read The Cycles of Heaven and find out the actual mechanics of what's screwing with you, and here's the meat and potatoes of it. So again, going back to what I was talking of a few minutes ago, not only is the Earth subject to the sun in terms of these electromagnetic forces, but all of us on the planet are subject to the Earth's fields, what they convey and what they regularize, which has to do also with everything that you were mentioning previously when you were talking about, well, there are recognitions of mathematical and architectural realities that are the same in places like Egypt and in ancient America, when you have sort of pyramidal-based structures and architectural constructs like that appearing in dislocated areas. There's the missing link, you might say, when you get into this area of mental awareness and perception. So when you get down to the human body, and this is where it gets really fun and almost somewhat scary, but it's also fascinating. And if you go into a book like Mind War and you look up the concept of fields, there's a whole force there that has to do with life fields and thought fields, because thought fields are also a field phenomenon, which is, again, one of these sort of burning realities that people aren't very much aware of. But let's look at the simple thing. Let's look at a life field, because when you were asking about an aura, or an astral self, what you're looking at is the electromagnetic field that externally organizes your body and its construction. Let's say that you cut your arm, and a few days later it's healed, and the skin appears the same as it was before. Okay, so how does your body know how to do that? How come when it rebuilt those cells, it didn't rebuild them into something that looks like a miniature giraffe or a platypus or something?
It's like the light body. The light body is the
There's
blueprint.
there's an organizational electromagnetic field that surrounds your body, which is what people are really talking about when they're talking about things like, auras and astral selves and so on. And this electromagnetic field is what controls the way that your body functions and rebuilds itself. Do you think that you're living in the same body now that you were 6 months ago? Nope, not at all. To put it very simply, there are about 60,000 billion cells in the human body. And every day, about 500 billion of these die and are replaced. So your body is a constant furnace of death and regeneration going on all the time. There is no part of you, including your brain, that is the same as it was 6 months ago. It's all new. And most people say, well, wait a minute, I'm the same person. I'm the same person. I have the same problems, with my big toe or something that I had 6 months ago. Well, yes, your body remembers these things because of this external organizational field that controls it and that rebuilds it all the time. And this is the controlling program that keeps it in order. And this is the same thing that happens in your brain in thought architecture with thought fields, because somewhere around the second or third grade, you learned how to multiply 3 times 2. Okay, but those brain cells that originally learned that have long since died and been replaced. So how is it that you know today, or all and pretty much constantly since then, how to multiply 3 times 2 and have it come out the right way? It's because your thought, which is to say that consciousness that's the real you, is actually an external field outside of your physical brain. And this is where, as I said, some people will have their eyeballs rolled and they'll say, wow, he's saying that I exist as a conscious entity outside of myself? Well, yes.
Well,
actually.
yes, exactly, yes. I mean, an associate, I remember when Dr. Rowney Kilda, she was former chief medical officer of Finland. She was at a UFO conference with Colonel Alexander and I think it was John Stubblebine. Is that I probably got the name wrong?
General Stubblebine, sure.
Yeah, this is a long time ago, about 1992 or something. But she went out of body. But as a doctor, she just tested it. She and she literally was able to lift her arm, check her pulse. But she was lifting her physical arm with something. It must have been her energetic arm, and measuring energetically as if she didn't realize you're not meant to do that, but she was doing it. So the aspect of the non-physical, so-called, well, they're both physical things. The energetic field that you're talking about has a physical action and perception. But
well, sure it does, because it's operating in the electromagnetic spectrum.
Which is the key problem. The key problem with this cyborg group that want to make humans into cyborgs because they have a problem with the brain, because they think that the only thing that's in the brain is the electrical pulses flying around in his brain cells. But
and no, it isn't, because the thing that's the conscious self is outside it. It's the governing field. It's the thought field, and they can't touch that. That's why we're having this, bumping up your nose, when people try to say, I can create a computer that can duplicate human thinking. Well, no, you can't. You can create one that will duplicate the mechanical functions of the brain inside that field, but you have to be the organizing field outside it that basically delineates its external boundaries. And that's what we as conscious entities do as ourselves within our own bodies. So that if you slice off your arms and your legs, you aren't any less Miles. You know, the thing that's conceptually Miles could give a less of a damn whether you have arms or legs, except as they are extensions, or as I sometimes refer to them, the training wheels on a bicycle for your consciousness, which is the real Miles, to be fully aware of itself, because that's your interactive device between yourself and the objective universe.
I think that Lynn McTaggart published a book some time ago, The Field. But also, is this the reason why space flight in a tin can, like an Apollo capsule, doesn't work? Because the energetic biogenic, I call it biogenic field that you're referring to, doesn't make it stable once we leave the Earth. Is that a problem?
Well, I don't think so. From the people that I've talked with, you know, who've been involved in space, you know, astronauts and so on.
I mean, I'm talking about
they don't have any problem with their any problem with their personal consciousness being intact.
In terms of, I'm referring to once you start getting any distance from the Earth. I
don't see it. I mean, the ones that I've talked to, including some of the ones who've been to the moon and so on, they can
we talk about that some other time. I'm a big Apollo fan.
They don't have a problem with disconnection with their thought fields, because their thought fields are very closely aligned to their body, but only when you actually get rid of the body completely, which happens at the moment of physical death, that you might say, you have a necessary rupture, you know, between the conscious self and the physical self.
The so-called,
as I mentioned a little earlier, the Egyptians divided this down into 8 different levels of the soul, or the mind star, and when you get beyond about the first 3 or 4 of them, then you get into that dividing line between the physical and the metaphysical. And some of this gets very weird, you know, but again, it's actually much more methodical and much more simple.
A bit like reincarnation.
People would realize.
Well, we're approaching.
Yeah.
Is that mechanism? Is that how it works? This field.
Well, your reincarnation says that you bounce from physical body to physical body over linear time, because your consciousness needs a physical body to perceive and identify itself. And it's actually a somewhat flawed, you know, concept in the way that most people use it, because they persist in saying, well, I'm always going to need training wheels to extend myself and to recognize myself. My answer to that, as the Egyptians would have answered it, is no. You know, your conscious self is bound up in your ba and your ka, so to speak, and once it's aware of itself, it only needs the body, or the kabit soul, as they would refer to it, as an additional introduction to itself. Once it becomes self-aware, it doesn't need a body anymore. It exists in and of itself as a conscious entity, and then, if it needs to, it can create external realities for itself, including, if needed, any number of physical body concepts. But it doesn't need a pre-designed one anymore. It doesn't need that initial set of training wheels. And again, this is sort of an elementary kind of thing.
So essentially, this is ascension. It's the concept of sort of ascension, going from the physical to the
well, that would be again, that's a term that is often used in a fuzzy sense, but yes, it would be very close to that in the terms that the real you is a metaphysical thing. It's not a physical thing. You're not simply the sum total of your brain cells. The real you is a metaphysical entity which only uses the physical you as a set of training wheels to get used to itself. You find out who you are by sort of bumping into things that you're not. You know, like if you have a temporary human body and you slam your fist into a file cabinet, you say, okay, well, I am definitely not part of that file cabinet. No.
Well,
you use your physical body in the same way that you'd use an automobile that you're driving in.
Briefly, as we're coming to the close of Basis 70 Part 2, on Easter Sunday, 2017, from wonderful Wiltshire, where the home of the crop circles, and you're in, is it San Francisco or Los Angeles?
Yes.
where
Francisco.
I'm sure it's a wonderful place. Briefly, what in a nutshell, a couple of minutes, you want to actually say, get across as we close out on this part?
Well, I would say that my most practical recommendation, again, I've written a number of books that have to do with a variety of interesting topics, but also a lot of historical topics, but also one that I think is very practical and very important, which is what the Mind War series is involved with, which is that I think that right now the world out there is a very dangerous and very irrational place where there's a lot of misery and a lot of bloodshed going on. And I wrote the Mind War book going into a lot of subjects that have previously been rather close-hold and sort of things that sort of doors that people didn't want opened. And I opened these things and I said, here is a very practical and very real way to get rid of the danger of physical war, which is by seizing control of that irrational, violent, haphazard 95% and bringing it under an enlightened, sensible kind of control. And here is the ethical program for it, and here are the mechanical means to do it, which I refer to as psychons. I listed about 13 or 14 of these mechanisms, control systems. And then there are the follow-up books, Mind Star, that has to do with examining this concept of the soul that we've just been discussing in the last few minutes. And the third one, Find Far, that has to do with these dimensional aspects and the projection of these things in a time continuum, which we were also discussing. So I'd say to your audience that's interested in finding out whether Aquino's making sense or whether he's full of BS, I'd say go look me up, Michael Aquino, Aquino, on Amazon. Get the list of my books there. Look for that Mind War, Mind Star, Find Far series. Look for some of the others if you enjoy them. That's perfectly fine with me too. But those are the ones that we've been hammering on today. And they're important because they have to do with human suffering and human death and human trauma and the alleviation of it, which I think we are dealing with now in a very rapidly closing window of opportunity. As the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists puts it, the doomsday clock hands are very close to midnight these days. We don't have a lot of time to screw around with this stuff anymore. And the more that we stop beating each other up and blowing each other up, the better. So if you look up a book like Mind War and you like what you see in it, then apply it as best you can. If you want to bring it to the attention of somebody who's in a policy-making mode, by all means do so. I don't promise that this is a get-out-of-jail-free card. I simply say that it is one way of addressing the current system that has the potential to bring us back from the ultimate danger of our self-extinction. So that would be my takeaway message from this. If you've been fascinated sort of by what you've heard today, I'd say you want to see the details, you want to see the hard science behind it all, go look up those books, take a look, and have at it. And if you can improve on it, by all means, improve on it.
Well, Michael Aquino, thank you very much for visiting the Basis Project. We're pushing the boat out all the time. That's what we want to bring solutions to some of these terrible things we've heard about over these years. And let's get together, work together, and bring peace to this beautiful planet we live in. And thank you very much. By all means.
Okay, thank you for inviting me.
And thank you, sir, and good night.
Good night.